Can everyone please find a seat? We'll get started in just a moment. If everyone can please find a seat. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. Wow, man, who was that? All right. I'm the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Library Hour. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Our mission is to create better informed, more engaged citizen leaders. And as you all know, we do that through a variety of programs, including programs like tonight's Library Hour. We also have civics education, scholarships, programs that are about our collections, our wonderful history, the values of this great institution, the Union League of Philadelphia. This crowd in particular might be interested to know that we have recently, just within the last 2 years, taken on the responsibility of the historic preservation of this great historic house, as well as the guardhouse out in Gladwin. And we are now working on our first project that we have funded, which is the restoration of the facade on Broad Street. So all of that work is made possible through voluntary contributions from members and others who share our values and want to protect our great collection and our history. And all of that work to raise that money happens through our development committee. And I want to recognize the chair of our development committee who's here tonight, Dr. Gary Dorsheimer. Gary, thank you for all your work. Thank you. I also want to recognize our veterans today. Today is Veterans Day. And as we all know, the Union League is dedicated to supporting our military and our veterans. So I would like all of our veterans to please stand who are with us today and be recognized. Thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you. A few housekeeping items. The program tonight will run about an hour in total. We will have a Q&A that will be moderated really by me. We'll have microphones throughout the audience. Please use the microphones. We are on Zoom and on YouTube, and people cannot hear your questions unless you speak into the microphone. And as always, questions, please keep them to 3 sentences or less. And if you cannot put a question mark at the end of that last sentence, you have failed. Some upcoming programs as well. This coming Monday, we have a great public affairs program with Kenny Wu on the inconvenient minority, Asian Americans in the United States. I think it's going to be a fascinating program. That's this coming Monday. And then on the 22nd, we have a Liberty Series program. It's a Supreme Court overview, preview, a look at the Supreme Court, important cases and other issues of the Supreme Court with Jeff Rosen from the National Constitution Center and Robbie George from Princeton University. I hope you can join us for those. And without any further ado, I will introduce the man who clearly needs no introduction to this crowd, Mr. Jim Mundy, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Mike. All right, I'll buy another drink afterwards, just so you know. Okay. All right. It is my absolute pleasure to be introducing Michael Lewis tonight. Known him for ages, and one of the great, really good guys in terms of architecture in the city of Philadelphia. So I will do the formal one, and then we'll fool around a little bit in just a few minutes. So Michael J. Lewis teaches modern architecture and American art at Williams College. And if you haven't been there up in Northwestern Massachusetts, it's worth the trip, especially the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute, which is phenomenal in its own way. Michael is also the architecture critic for the Wall Street Journal. And Michael is a Philly guy. He's from the neighborhood of Mayfair. And after receiving his Bachelor of Arts from Haverford College in 1980, he spent 2 years at the University of Hanover in Germany, and he then received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1989. He has taught at Bryn Mawr, McGill University in Montreal, and the University of Natal in South Africa. And apparently Michael doesn't like working close to Philadelphia for some odd reason. We'll have to figure that one out later on. That can be somebody's first question tonight. So his books include Frank Furness, Architecture and the Violent Mind, The Gothic Revival, American Art and Architecture, and I am proud to say I have all 3 of them in my my modest book collection at home. They're all great books. And of course, the prize-winning August Reichensperger, The Politics of German Gothic Revival, which was not something I don't have that one, just so you know. That's a little more arcane, I think, but be that as it may. Michael was a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton between 2000 and 2001, and in 2008 received a Guggenheim Fellowship to support the completion of City of Refuge in 2016, his study of millennial utopias. Michael has been at Williams College since 1993, and in 2008 he was named the Faison Pearson Stoddard Professor of Art. But actually, Michael is more famous in Philadelphia because he's married to Susan Glassman, who's the director of the Widener Institute of Free Science. And if you haven't been there, you should go there. It's one of the great unheralded, unknown museums in the entire city. It's phenomenal in of itself. So hopefully, Mike, when he talks about architecture, describes it as kind of Janus-like, that is, it's two-faced. There's the comic part and then there's the tragic part. And if you're from Philadelphia, you understand that entirely because Philadelphia is based on comedy and tragedy simultaneously. So hopefully we'll hear a lot about that from Michael himself. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Michael J. Lewis. Michael. So we need to get to say hello earlier. Thank you.
Thanks for mentioning Susan. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate the mention of my wife's museum, Widener Free Institute of Science. Go and see it. I couldn't be happier to be in this building to give this talk about Philadelphia. And my talk is going to be about why this building is one of the quintessential landmarks of Philadelphia. But I should say the first time I came to this building was April 1994. I don't know if anyone was a member in April 1994, but that was the month that the architectural historians had our national organization had its professional meeting for the first time in decades. We stayed at the Bellevue Stratford, but the opening reception was in the Union League, and all 350 some architectural historians marched north on Broad Street, came up the grand Baroque stair of the Union League, moved ever westward, and then they made a left turn to go up the stairs, another French Baroque stair with a landing. And you've got to understand, of these 350 architectural historians, I think there may have been 3 registered Republicans. And you could gauge that because at the top of the landing was something that they had never seen before. It was a life-size standing portrait of President Richard Milhouse Nixon, draped in black crepe, because it was the week, of course, of his funeral. And I stood at the top of the stairs looking down to see the shockwave moving through the group, and I could see the expression, is it ironic? No, it's real. And it was a great Philadelphia moment. It was a great American moment. Thank you for coming out to hear about this book. This book is a collection of 21 essays written over 35 years about Philadelphia. I didn't know I was writing a book about Philadelphia. All the pieces are what authors call occasional pieces. An odd book review, some of them would be an article about a document I discovered or an architectural drawing. There's an obituary of Robert Venturi, Philadelphia architect, written at great haste to meet a deadline. So the book you're looking at is not a beautifully shaped Greek temple that was planned. The book you're looking at is more of a shapeless coral reef that grew up by accretion over the decades. But looking back, I think it does have a shape. I realized when the book came out that in some sense it's my own autobiography, although I didn't know it. The earliest essays were written when I was in my 20s. I went to Haverford College in Philadelphia. I went there outside Philadelphia in the main line. I didn't know I was interested in architecture. I kind of liked Haverford because it didn't seem to care about architecture. It had a kind of Quaker indifference. There's our Founders Hall, 1831. But my first day there, I was captivated by this other college, Bryn Mawr, which I found much more charming, picturesque, fantastical. And it was during my final year at Haverford as an economics major where I wandered into a class at Bryn Mawr on architectural history that changed my life. And 2 of the essays in the book are about those 2 buildings. Haverford's Founders Hall, where I ferreted out the name of the architect. Took me a long time to find it. It is in no history of Haverford. They didn't care about it. And I sent my discovery to the president, and I didn't get an answer. I still don't think they care about it. And I wrote about the building in the top Pembroke Hall at Bryn Mawr, which in the Chronicle of Higher Education I said is America's most perfect dormitory building ever built. And it actually 2 of my sisters lived there. But what happened in my final year of college is I wandered into this course and we took a walking tour of Philadelphia, and this strange mutilated torso of a building was shown to us. I didn't understand it, and I was perplexed when my professor, George Thomas, some of you may know, described the building as hilarious. Now this bothered me, not the building, but the word hilarious. How could a building be funny? This seemed to be conflating two. It's like telling me that a floor lamp was impetuous or that a sofa was cheeky. But then I realized a building is made by a person, and a person could have a sense of humor. So the first architect I became interested in was that architect, Willis Gaylord Hale, which is another one of the essays in the book. Because of that encounter, I told my professor I wanted to do more with architecture. I got a grant to study the architecture of my hometown. I was then living in Wilkes-Barre, and I found out Wilkes-Barre was crawling with Philadelphia architects. There's 4 of them, and there is an essay about each of them in my book. I didn't know I was doing it. They accumulated over time. Later, in later years, I started writing architectural criticism. I've been with the Wall Street Journal now for 3 years doing monthly reviews and obituaries. And so I was told when I had the job that I would do about 1 a month, but I might have to do an obituary at very short notice. And the shortest notice I got wasn't an obituary. I got a phone call, Michael, Notre Dame is on fire. You have 2 hours. We need 800 words. And that was a heartbreaking one. Anyway, so the book runs through scholarship, obituaries, criticism, his fuddy-duddy, pedantic historical articles. So when Paul Dry, the Philadelphia publisher, proposed an anthology of my pieces, I thought very foolishly, as it turned out, this is going to be the easiest book I've ever written. All I have to do is renumber the pages and hit send. Well, that turned out not to be the case for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is because of the internet. Things that I had written in the 80s and 90s were researched using the tools available at the time, which didn't include newspaper databases. So I had written a piece about the architect, Edwin Forrest Durang, the chief architect of the Catholic Archdiocese, who did most of the Catholic churches between 1860 and 1910 in Eastern Pennsylvania. I had written a piece about him, which I was going to send to my publisher, and I did a quick spot check of historic newspapers and found out something I didn't know. He had painted, one of the painters of a gigantic rolling panorama of the Mississippi River where the towns went rolling by. This is the cinema in embryo. You would sit there, the organ or piano would play, there would be lecture songs, and you would have a fictitious trip down the Mississippi. It probably was ghastly. We have some lithographs of parts of it, but what it did was teach Durang to design quickly, imaginatively, and think in terms of picturesque, rollicking silhouettes, a jubilee of motion on the skyline. So I had to rewrite the whole article because it turns out that the only way to understand Durang is his origin as a picturesque maker of panoramas. And then you can understand the dynamic, nervous anxiety that freights his buildings. And they're all over Philadelphia. I mean, they're all over Philadelphia. And if you're Catholic or have been to a Catholic funeral or wedding in Philadelphia, you have been in one of his buildings. Another thing that happened to me, I realized I'm a different person at the age of 64 than I was at 44, 34, and all of us are. And I realized as I've gotten older, I thought differently about architects. I thought about their life journeys. I thought about what that happened to them when they were young. I thought about their struggles and I thought about their tragedies. And I found again and again, I wanted to think more about who these people were. Louis Kahn, Robert Venturi, Frank Furness, Durang, the architect of the Academy of Music, Gustav Runge, and our friend Willis Hale. So what I'm going to do briskly is place this building, which isn't in the book. And the thing you have to know about this building, it's on Broad Street. And I realized when I got the invitation from Jim Mundy that my book has many, many buildings on Broad Street. And there's a certain pattern to those buildings. One of them is the Academy of Music. If you haven't seen a show there, you can. I think there'll be the Nutcracker again. Of course, the biggest is City Hall. One of them you won't see because it's torn down. It's where the John G. Johnson collection was, which is now a mainstay of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And another one, which you might recognize if you're my age, this is the Peter Widener House, which once stood at Broad and Girard. I have an essay about each of those buildings in the book. Now, the thing is, William Penn designed Broad Street. There it is. There's the 1682 plan. It was a major thoroughfare. It's the only really big street in the city with market. The plan was Philadelphia would be an evenly spaced Quaker grid. It's sort of the logic of the Quaker meeting house, non-hierarchical, no display of power, turned into a street plan. That was the plan, but what happened, of course, is the land here on the Delaware is much richer, more valuable than the land on the Schuylkill. So what happened is, for the first 150 years of our history, development centers here. That's why all the, what did I do? Did I turn it off? I turned it off. All right. All the early views of Philadelphia into 1800 are the waterfront, right? The waterfront along the Delaware. And Pennsylvania Hospital, where I was born, was in the suburbs, 9th and Pine. It was outside the city. So development doesn't really hit Broad Street in a big way until after the Civil War. So the cultural, political, and social life of Philadelphia is gathered around Independence Hall, the first great cluster of public buildings in Philadelphia. And there they are published when this was the capital of the United States. Those buildings were, in effect, the federal government. Now, what happens after the Civil War, the years of the Civil War, is a colossal rethinking of Philadelphia's cultural life. All the institutions pre-Civil War, and there they are, the Academy of Natural Sciences, there's Philadelphia City Hall, there's the Masonic Temple. They all reinvent themselves, give themselves new images like that. They become more Victorian, more restless, more truculent. These are buildings that want to pick a fight with you. Well, they've gone through the Civil War, and they all move. They all move west, and most of them line up on right there on Broad Street, except the Academy of Natural Sciences, which overshot it, and but they gave themselves a great site. So we have, in effect, America's longest straight street until California development happens in the 1920s. It's a fabulous panorama. And for the first time in our history, Philadelphia has a street big enough for buildings to breathe. That is, the street now is over 100 feet wide instead of the 30 and 40 feet labyrinth of streets down in the old city. And as the street gets bigger, the cities become more, the buildings become more sculptural, more plastic. They admit more generous views. And the first great cultural one is the Academy of Music. And this is the first building I wrote on seriously because I made a discovery. A minor discovery when I was in Germany. I found the student records of the architect who designed it, who turned out to be a German. I heard the Philadelphia legend growing up that the money ran out as they were building it, so they quit. They did a quick, cheap, and dirty factory facade, hoping for more money after the Civil War to finish the building, and they never got around to it. That was the story. It's a great story. Like many great urban legends, it's a lie, but it describes something truthful. The building has always been inscrutable to Philadelphians. I found as many of the competition drawings as I could for it in 1854. And it's quite a variety of different styles. Some tasteful, some a little awkward. This is Durang, the Catholic Church architect. It's his earliest known design. He couldn't quite line up the windows with the pediment. Stephen Button here was a very popular man. A colossal dome that expresses nothing inside inexplicably won the second prize. The finest one was by a German firm, Collins and Autenrieth, who did the only grace note of reseating the second story So there's a very handsome screen of columns defining it. Otherwise, everyone used the property line to the maximum. And that was the winning design by Gustav Runge from Bremen. Very festive Venetian design. And it wasn't built. What was built was a rather desperate revision of it below. And this is the one that was always assumed to be a cheap, low budget factory substitution. What nobody recognized, though, was what it was this. This was the architecture that Runge had studied in Karlsruhe, Germany. This is the Karlsruhe School of Architecture, the Polytechnical School. And it was absolutely modern, up-to-date, contemporary, cutting-edge German architecture with an unpronounceable name, Rundbogenstil, which is round bow style, round arch style. And what it was doing was referring to the New York Academy of Music by another German architect, Alexander Zeltzer there. So this is the building that Philadelphia cringingly imitated when we built ours. And it tells you that the story is that our building is saturated with anxiety about being modern. As it steps out on the street of Philadelphia, it's connecting itself deliberately to the modern currents of Europe, fashionable and theoretical European architecture. So it's the very opposite of a temporary factory facade. Buy the book and read the essay. Well, yeah. So Broad Street, though, it's a place of display and prestige, but where does the prestige ends? This is a prestigious address, but it becomes progressively and incrementally less prestigious as you move north and south. And Philadelphia tested the limits of the socially acceptable right after the Civil War with the will of the famous Rush will that gave us the Ridgeway Library, which is, pardon the expression, south of South Street, which is social death in Philadelphia. Legal battles raged through 1869, 1870 to prevent that thing from being built. The will, unlike the Barnes will, turned out to be fireproof, lock-picking proof, and the thing was built. It's been a bit of an albatross ever since, but it temporarily pushed the center of social gravity southward, and it attracted these two people who were family friends of the Rush and Ridgeway families, stately Quaker families of Philadelphia. Bloomfield Moore, who had one of the country's great paper mills, and his author wife, Clara Jessup Moore, they decide to build their mansion at 510 South Broad Street, just below Lombard. More social death then, maybe not so much now. And they chose as their architect Frank Furness. And I found in my essay on this building that Furness was the architect. And this is an extraordinary building. It is the great missing link in Philadelphia architecture. We do not have a photograph of Furness's facade. It only stood for 20 years before the facade was removed. I'm showing you a photograph I don't think this has ever been published. This is a photograph of Furness in his prime, striding down the street next to one of his train stations with the bolt upright posture. Well, it is Veterans Day, and he was a veteran, the only architect of note to win the Congressional Medal of Honor, who worked on this building. So there he is. He's got the posture of a cavalryman. In fact, today's Veterans Day, and his birthday is tomorrow, so we can celebrate it. So Furness is up and down Broad Street, buildings that we know, his great Academy of Fine Arts, and buildings that are long gone, his Rodef Shalom Synagogue at Broad and Mount Vernon, and his fabulous Lutheran church at Broad and Arch, all of them gone. His building for Clara Jessup Moore and Bloomfield Moore was his personality unleashed, manhood at its most extreme. It was completed while the Moores were spending a year-long vacation in Paris. And we know from a document I discovered and published in the book that Mrs. Moore was horrified at what Furness did. And I found this out, I found this out in an article she wrote in which she named no names, but talked about the problems modern women have with architects. And as soon as you realize the description of the house, you realize she's talking about her own house, but with Victorian discretion doesn't name Furness. And she tells a remarkable story how she did not ask Mr. Furness to design a baronial fireplace fitted for a gentleman's club. And Furness explained, we can have it altered. And Mrs. Moore said huffily, I will not inconvenience my husband at further expense. And Furness said to her horror, he need not know. Mrs. Moore said, well, how can that be? And Furness said, have you never heard the story of the captain's trousers? And we have here the only account of Furness talking to a client. And it's startling because Furness said, well, the captain's trousers. The captain returns from a long sea cruise, gives the manifest to the ship's owner. He says, all right, I authorize this expense, this expense. Wait, what's this? A pair of trousers? Your trousers? I'm not paying for that. Crosses it out. On the next journey, tells Furness, the captain returns, submits his manifest. The owner says, well, I'm glad to see that there's no trousers here. The captain said, there are, but you won't find them. And this horrified Mrs. Moore, so much so that 20 years later, she could give a verbatim account of it. Anyway, the house horrified everyone in Philadelphia, which is why when it was sold in 1894, it was given a tasteful French facade like this. But I have been able to work out from her description of the house that it was a copy of the Martin Brimmer house in Boston, and it would have looked pretty much like this before the facelift was applied. Anyway, socially conscious, socially self-conscious, and constantly submitting itself to liposuction on South Broad. And there the two of them are two of Philadelphia's fiercest personalities. I think she might have been shocked by Furness using the word trousers to a lady. That's the south end of Broad Street. The north end, we've got another minuet of what is fashionable and who is fashionable. This man, Peter Widener, came from every possible wrong side of tracks there are in Philadelphia. His family, German, Dutch origin, were butchers. He made his fortune selling mutton to the Union Army during the Civil War. He turned the mutton revenue into developing lots in North Philadelphia. He turned the profits from the lot in buying the street railway, and he turned the profits from buying the street railway into buying Rembrandts. And those are the Rembrandts that are the mainstay of the National Gallery in Washington. He made his money spectacularly, and he wanted a spectacular house to show it, and he got Philadelphia's most spectacular young architect, Willis Hale, to design it. And there it was, Broad and Girard, a massive house with many bizarre passages, including stone that goes up and down and sideways. It's as if the brownstone were knitted together as a textile material, normally something people don't do with brownstone. And in the back, in this building, he built his own painting gallery. And this is one of the great architectural renderings of all time, showing the paintings he owned and fanciful visions of him and his wife, but made much younger, thinner, and more attractive. Great architectural marksmanship. And this is the beginning of an entire enclave of Northwest Philadelphia developed by Peter Widener and William Elkins, his business partner, which went on and on to infinity. Mass-produced construction, mills on the site to mass-produce the lumber to build them, but flash in the pan fashionability. Very fashionable in 1886 when it opened, and a long, slow plummet into unfashionability. By 1896, Widener was becoming embarrassed by Willis Hale's pyrotechnics on Chestnut Street. I don't think he was embarrassed in the early 80s, but he became embarrassed when Boston critics started publishing reviews of them and calling them architectural aberrations here. Within 2 years of the aberrations starting to make fun of Willis Hale, very discreetly, Peter Widener gave his house to what was the new Free Library of Philadelphia. and built himself a new house, Linwood Hall, up at Elkins Park. And for his architect is Horace Trumbauer. I hope you know Horace Trumbauer. You are in a Horace Trumbauer building. Yeah, and the rack could go, oh, I turned that off again. What about the Widener house? This is the first building that I was interested in writing about. When I went to Germany on my Fulbright in 1980, I had in my suitcase the notes for an article which was going to be about Willis Hale's career. And the goal of it would be to save the Widener mansion from destruction because there was an arson threat. It was abandoned. On the plane next to me, also going for a Fulbright, was another American. He was doing chemistry, I think, and we were talking about our projects. And I started to say, well, I'm doing something, but it's very obscure. You won't know it. I'm working on an architect in North Philadelphia. He says, what? I said, well, the Widener mansion, but you don't know it. He says, oh, I know it. I said, no, I don't think you do because it's in far North Philadelphia. No one knows it. He said, yeah, I think I saw it on TV last night as it burned down. So one of the most extraordinary coincidences of my life, there are many, but this was, so this book belatedly, 35 years later, I tell the story of the house. Philadelphia gets consolidated in 1855. The narrow gridded city of William Penn now takes up the whole county, and Broad Street goes up pretty much the whole thing. And now our tiny little city hall at Independence Hall is too minuscule. We need a new city hall. The first plans are wonderful physical manifestations of Philadelphia cheapness. Let's just build a brick box around Independence Hall as cheaply as we can. This was the 1858 plan by Samuel Sloan, which got serious consideration. Wiser heads prevailed. A competition was held in 1860. And instead of building an Independence Hall, two city hall buildings were planned for Center Square, one a courthouse and one a municipal building. The architect was John MacArthur. And you know what he's looking at in 1860? The newest important civic building in America, the Capitol in Washington, by his teacher, Thomas Eustace Walter. So there would have been a glorious little paraphrase of the United States Capitol on Center Square. It was not to be. The Civil War intervened. And by the time the project began again after the Civil War, taste had changed. A new taste came into America and into Philadelphia, French Second Empire, the chief hallmark of which is this funny roof, the mansard roof, called a French roof. And the first prestigious building in Philadelphia to have it was the US Post Office right next to the Customs House on the 300 block, right next to the Customs House. Overnight, Philadelphia fashion changed and all of Philadelphia responded, but no one responded faster than the organization that John and Jim serve, the Union League, because the first great mansarded building on Broad Street is this building, designed by John Fraser, right? There's his drawing, the teacher of Frank Furness. So the circle closes. So when Philadelphia City Hall begins rethinking what it's going to look like after the Civil War, it is automatically, by destiny, it must be a French Second Empire building. But there was a failure of nerve. They were afraid that the city development would never really reach Broad Street. So the earliest proposals would have wrapped it around Independence Hall. And you see that astonishingly in this model, which tells you why Philadelphia City Hall has a tower. In the first design of 1869 by John MacArthur, he is echoing the cupola of Independence Hall, giving a recapitulation of it at a larger scale, pleasingly to knit old and new together. But this would have been a bad decision to anchor a growing city too much to the waterfront. Then they moved the site to Washington Square, which enraged other people, until finally in 1872, a city referendum chose finally where it should be, in the middle. But it meant that by the time John MacArthur made this design, the floor plan, he had designed it for 3 different sites 4 times repeatedly. It's as if a pianist had played every one of Bach's variations in every possible key, transposing it. So the building has an ineffable rightness. 3 things about it I'll call attention to that are in the book. One is the immense quality of the sculpture. No other public building in America has this degree of sculpture done by the Scottish mafia. There's John MacArthur, the architect, born in Scotland. There's Alexander Calder, the sculptor, grandfather of the Calder, born in Scotland. There are his assistants, also Scottish. The chief of works was a Scotsman. There they are in the great studio in the basement of the building. That's one of the things to look at. Another thing I learned in my research on this is the only building built after the Civil War that is not filled with military imagery, because this is a Quaker city. And there was founded right after the Civil War a Quaker Peace Commission, which lobbied the building committee of City Hall to ensure that it not glorify warfare. And they constantly beseeched John MacArthur and Calder to make the building about art, prosperity, culture, civilization, history, memory, progress, future, mining, everything, just not war. It's amazing in this city, which is the chief Union industrial city that fought the Civil War, which is deprived of military imagery. So the only soldiers you see are the statues, which, like smokers, are made to stand 20 feet away from the building in the rain to punish them. The last thing I discovered before the book went to press, I did a final run through the Philadelphia newspapers, and every day they're complaining about the cost overruns of Philadelphia City Hall. And I found something that no one else had found: a youthful visit to Philadelphia City Hall, the base of the tower with its 4 heroic columns showing the 4 races of the ancient world: red, white, yellow, brown. Miniature suffering atlases with little versions of their children in the corners, filled with energy and good humor. A visit to this by Rudyard Kipling in early 1890. It's in the book. And he couldn't believe it. He spent a half hour there looking at it, admiring it. You could see where Kipling would like the architectural display of energy and the jolliness of the whole thing. And that's Philadelphia City Hall. So that anchored Philadelphia on Broad Street perpetually, where it remains pleasingly today. And that's the building we're in. There's a closer look at that. I know we got to give questions. So let me say, you cannot write a book that's 35 years in the making without thinking about how you are. And I realize that's more than half of my life. And I look back and I realized that I got Philadelphia in my bones when we moved to Philadelphia, back to Philadelphia in 1965. I had gone to an elementary school in upstate Pennsylvania, which looked like this, Edwardian. And I started 3rd grade in this building in Mayfair, which is Bauhaus modern with an amazing curved corridor, which I thought was there because it looked like the curved corridor of the Starship Enterprise. And it was only later when I studied architecture, I realized it's so the principal could watch the whole playground. That's why he knew what we were doing. In other words, at the very beginning, I was inoculated with the weight of history, and I was inoculated with the clash between old and new, which to me is the subject of Philadelphia, because it's the subject of the human life, that we grow and change and become very different people. But to the end of our life, you're still the same person as that little picture your mother had on the mantle. So old and new are both rollicking through the building, and I hope they're rollicking through this room, because I'm ready for questions. Thank you.
That again. Can you hear me? Okay. Michael, thank you. Thank you so much. Questions? Yes, Kira, back here.
And it runs the gamut. In my experience, some architects accept willingly that their building is passed into time and has to change. Some architects have a proprietary feeling about their building that it's like a child, and it causes great pain to see. But if any architect who lives long enough will have heartbreak and see buildings demolished, I think it goes along with the profession. I mean, you really ask two questions. You ask about form following function, and you ask about the attitudes of architects. You mentioned The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, the objectivist philosopher. The great event in that book comes at the beginning, where Howard Rourke goes for his job interview. And if you reread it, you find she took it from Louis Sullivan's interview in Frank Furness's office. So Sullivan is Howard Rourke, and it's also Frank Lloyd Wright, but the job interview is straight, and I don't think that's have ever been published. It's straight. So the idea of the Fountainhead, of an architect who damns the whole world to pieces and follows his own will, has some debt to Frank Furness, who was a Civil War cavalry captain and sent men to their death and knew it. So also his profanity, which Sullivan speaks about, I think is part of the Howard Rourke explosive character. Good question. Let's talk with the architects later about this. I think you'll hear horror stories.
Your final slide brings to mind.
Yeah. 80s. That's a great question. I know some of you are transplanted Philadelphians. You don't know about this, but I think everyone knows Kevin Bacon, the actor. His father, Ed Bacon, legend in Philadelphia, in the city planning commission, enforced the unwritten law that mandated that no building could be higher than William Penn's hat, which is exactly 547 feet high, 8 feet lower than the Washington Monument. Once again, Philadelphia humility. And what would happen is developers would have proposals for skyscrapers, and as the Philadelphia legend goes, they'd come in to see Ed Bacon, who was strikingly handsome, patrician, more handsome than his son, actually, very tall, and he would kindly explain to the developer in this fabulous gravelly voice, well, you do understand we have a rule here that no building can be higher than William Penn's hat. Now, it's not written down anywhere. It's what we call a gentleman's agreement. Now, my question for you is, are you a gentleman? And everyone's shaking, yes, sir, until Willard Rouse. And that was 1986. And yeah, the Liberty Tower. And the consequences of that, some fabulous buildings, but Philadelphia looks more like other American cities. And one of the great things about this building that I discovered in the research was that the clock tower, just below the slide here, used to be visible from the entire county. And what would happen in 1900, they would turn it off at 8:55 every night, and right at 9, turn it on again, so all of Philadelphia could set their watch to it. And it had the function of a medieval town clock. So that's why it hurts to see it vanishing behind these newer buildings.
We're gonna try the microphone again. A question, I think, over here. Yes.
My question is about the top of City Hall. Why is it white and the second part of it, the lower part, is a darker color?
You may be.
I always thought they just forgot to paint it.
No, you may be embarrassing people in this room. It was all the same color. And when it was restored the last time in the, I guess it was early 90s, late 80s, let's just say, call him the city property manager, got estimates. And it turns out there's cheap paint, which is already pre-made, or you can match the paint to what the rest of the building is, but it costs more. So you are looking at Philadelphia's most conspicuous example of stinginess on the skyline. Yeah. Yeah.
Jim, you have a question back there?
Jim, I didn't know Bloomfield Moore was a founding member. That's great to know. Yeah, yeah. Jessup and Moore was the company. Yeah, yep.
Do we have any other questions? Yes.
I'll adhere to the 3 sentences. The first sentence is, you said that you developed a love of architecture at Haverford College, but as your sister, I would submit that your elaborate blanket forts were like an early indication that you cared about space and building.
Now, remember, it's got to end with a question mark.
And the question is, dealer's choice. You've described Sampson Street as the best extant example of what old Philadelphia was. Can you tell us why you love it?
Sansom Street?
Yes.
When?
Now, Sampson Street, river to river. Delancey Street, river to river, may be the most
Delancey.
beautiful street, but Sampson Street, the commerce, the individual small 3 stories is the best. Or you can tell us about Frank Furness's war song and how Orpheus sang it for us so beautifully in one of the only places in America where the architect was born is across from one of his greatest works.
Yep. Question mark. Yeah, my sister is referring to one of the great places in Philadelphia, which is Frank Furness's birthplace at 1426 Pine Street, where on the 100th anniversary of his death in 2012, we got a state historic marker placed there. So while you're around, and we had the Orpheus Club sing a rather scurrile Civil War song that he wrote for a regimental reunion. Good question. Jim, that's the central question of architectural fame. 20 people study architecture, and one of them is in the magazines 10 years later, and he's got 19 resentful friends. What happens? I don't know if it's personal charm. I don't hear any accounts of him being a great bon vivant. What he did was classical dignity without individual personality. And I think architectural fame is, you have to be a character. Furness was a character. Sullivan was a character. And even today, a lot of our celebrity architects are characters. Trumbauer, I think, was a socially adept man who hired the right people to develop his designs. But I look around in a Furness building, you can sniff him out. I know one of you is in the real estate business and is moving a Frank Furness property as we speak. You walk into a Furness building and you are aware of his personality. I don't know if Trumbauer had a personality. He was very good. But when you got Trumbauer, you didn't want Trumbauer's personality. You wanted classical respectability. I think that the answer is in that the absence of any sort of personal inflection. Maybe.
One final question, since you are a critic, correct? Architectural critic. give us your thoughts on the new Comcast tower and the Four Seasons.
The newest
Yes.
I'm ashamed to say I have not been up in it. I think I can't really judge that till I've seen. Yeah. Oh, yeah. My sister is prompting me. Norman
This
Foster.
is the last time we have a sister come for her.
Norman Foster, Sir Norman Foster is the architect of that. And I've reviewed some of his buildings. Extraordinary man. And I always feel a particular humility when I talk to someone who tells me about the site of Nazi bombs dropping on London in World War II. Just because of that, it would be hard for me to say something bad about the building.
My kids call it the Darth Vader building.
The tar-
Because it reminds them, they think that the emperor should be up there looking across the city of Philadelphia. Anyhow, thank you, Michael Lewis, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here this evening. We hope to see you on Monday, an inconvenient minority, Asian Americans in the United States, and then on the 22nd, Supreme Court preview with Jeff Rosen and Robert